Um, well, you just saw the scripture signed from Exodus chapter 2, which is our text for today. And I don't know, maybe you've heard of a guy, he's a columnist for the New York Times, and his name is David Brooks. And a few years ago, David Brooks published a book titled The Second Mountain, A Quest for the Moral Life. And what David Brooks argues in this book is he says, many of us, the image we use for life is that we view our lives as a sort of mountain to climb. And so many of us, we begin, when we're born, as we grow older, we start climbing the mountain of success and prestige and accomplishments and relationships. But David Brooks says that the most well-formed, most inspiring people, most mature people, most joyful people, he said in their lives, it's not one mountain that they climb, but they actually climb two. This is what he says. He says the goals of the first mountain are the normal goals that our culture endorses. To be a success, to be well thought of, to get invited into the right social circles, and to experience personal happiness. He said it's all the normal stuff. Nice home, nice family, nice vacation, good food, good friends, and so on. Now, those are all good things, right? It's not wrong to pursue those things. Those things do give some excitement to life. But here's the reality. Most of us, when we were born, the script we were handed was that this is what matters. Accomplish these things, pursue these things. And so from the very beginning, we're told you got to get into the right school, you got to know the right people, you got to do the right things, you got to do year-round sports because you don't want to but you got to accomplish, We're told the script we're given on day one is that you must climb that first mountain. But David Brooks points out that the first mountain is not everything, and that there's actually more to life than just what's on that first mountain. And what he says is that for most people, one of two things will happen. They will achieve success. They'll reach the top of the mountain. Most people, late 30s, early 40s, or late 40s, early 50s, they'll reach the top of the mountain. They'll say, all right, I've got all the relationships I ever wanted. I've got the house I wanted. I've got the success I've wanted. I've got the office I wanted. I've got everything I want. And then people go, I'm at the top of the mountain. Is that it? Is that all there is? And some of you are too young to believe that that's actually what's going to happen. But it's what happens. You get to the top. I think of Tom Brady, who on a 60-minute interview, he said, why do I have, 12 Super Bowl rings or however many he's got? He said a supermodel wife and hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank and still feel like there's got to be something more. The interviewer asked him, well, what do you think it is, Tom? And he said, my God, I wish I knew. And so that happens. Many people, they'll reach success, the top of the mountain, and then they'll go, there's got to be more than this. And so they begin a quest trying to figure out what else there is in life. Others, other people, it's not that they reach the top of the mountain, it's that they never do reach the top of the mountain. They face immense suffering that knocks them off the mountain. They're knocked off, the death of someone they love, a health scare, addiction, or some life-altering tragedy that throws off the progress that you thought you were going to make. You thought it was going to be nothing but upward progress your whole life. But many people will get knocked off the mountain before they ever get to the top. Other people will fall off the mountain through their own failure. Something will happen in their career, their marriage, their family, or their reputation. They'll do something to mess it all up. And whatever the cause, many people, whether it's through success, suffering, or failure, will find themselves knocked off of the first mountain of life. And when you get knocked off that first mountain, you're faced with real questions about who you really are. Who am I? What was I put on this world to do? What in this life is worth pursuing? Is there any God-given purpose to my life? Has God created me for anything meaningful? And some people, what happens is they get knocked off the first mountain, and instead of using that as an opportunity to learn and grow, many people will stubbornly just keep trying to climb the same mountain their whole lives. And they'll waste their lives away, never learning from their mistakes, and they never grow. And that's tragic when someone spins their wheels for a lifetime climbing that first mountain. But David Brooks says that the wise, those who are wise, when you realize that the first mountain is not all there is, the wise people will go on a quest for something more. You look for a different mountain to climb. And he calls this the second mountain. And this is where we reckon with our true selves. and our calling on this earth. It's where we experience self-awareness. It's where we come to terms with our flaws and our limits and our limitations, and it's where we shift from selfishness to others-centeredness, to selflessness. To climb the second mountain, to live the second half of life, means that you're not just living out of the script that was handed to you when you were given at birth. But rather, you're not living for the approval of others either, but rather you live with a sense of purpose and a sense of commitment. This is what the book of Exodus is a book about redemption. It's about God redeeming the people of Israel, but it's also a book about God redeems individuals. And many of us, our lives can be redeemed. And I don't know, when I read about the second mountain, other spiritual authors will call it the second half of life. I go, that's the mountain I want to conquer. You know, I mean, am I the only one? I want to conquer the second mountain, the one where I discover my purpose and I want to discover how my life fits into what God has plans for the world. And we're studying the book of Exodus, and today we see Moses. He falls off the first mountain and he begins the climb on the second. And you'll see that this had to happen. He had to fall off the first mountain. Moses was not born a ready-made, prepackaged deliverer for his people. We often think of Moses as lifting the, staff and saving the Israelites, but Moses wasn't born ready for that moment. He had to be formed into it like the rest of us. None of us were born ready to fulfill all that God has for us. We all have rough edges, right? I've got quite a few of them. I imagine you've got some as well. And what the process of spiritual maturity is having our rough edges sanded down by the character of Jesus and becoming the person that he has called us to be so that we can accomplish the purposes he has for our life. And for Moses to step off the first mountain and into the second, he has to come to grips with who he was, his flaws, his pain. He has to put his selfishness behind him so that he could lead others to freedom. He needed to experience freedom first before he could lead others. And the last time we saw Moses was last week. He was a 3-month-old. He was born an Israelite. He was born a Hebrew. And he was brought into the palace of Pharaoh to be raised by Pharaoh's daughter through a series of circumstances, right? Pharaoh was committing infanticide. He was killing all the Hebrew children. Moses' mother put him in a basket, sent him down the river. Moses was picked up out of the basket by Pharaoh's daughter and was brought into the palace where he was raised. And that's an interesting childhood. You've got to imagine that he's a Hebrew, and we'll see in a moment that Moses was aware of his Hebrew background. And so he grows up as a Hebrew, but yet he's raised in the upper echelons of Egyptian culture. So here he is a part of an oppressed minority group, but yet he's living in the palace of the oppressors. He's going to the best schools, he's connected to the most powerful people, he's going to all the dinner parties, wearing all the right clothes, doing all the right things, and yet, as he's living this life of prestige and privilege, he knows that his people are suffering in the land. That's a confusing childhood. You got to imagine like the trauma of that. Being from an oppressed minority group, but growing up among those who are the oppressors. And the central question of Moses' adolescence was likely some form of the question we all ask, which is, who am I? Like, who am I in this world? For Moses, he was going, am I an Egyptian? Am I a Hebrew? What does my life mean? I mean, that's a confusing childhood, but that's the environment that Moses grew up in. And here's our text for today. We get into verse 11. It says, one day when Moses had grown up, Acts chapter 7 tells us he was 40 at this point. It says he went out to his people. So he knew who they were. He knew that he was an Israelite. And he went to look on their burdens. He's questioning his identity. He goes out, he goes for a walk just to observe what life was like for the Hebrews. I've got girls in my house, so I'm thinking we got princesses going on in our house, so I'm thinking of Aladdin. Jasmine, that scene where she leaves the palace of Agrabah, she's just kind of walking around Agrabah to see what the peasants are up to. I think that's kind of what Moses is doing. He's going, what I'm a Hebrew, but yet I'm living like this. I wonder what my people, what life looks like for them. And so he's walking through Egypt looking at these people. And he's imagining perhaps what his life would have been like if he had not been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And like many of us, it's possible that Moses hasn't handled his questions of identity well. And this causes him to be angry and confused. He probably, all those conflicting feelings he felt as a child. Who am I? Am I an Egyptian? Am I a Hebrew? You kind of get the sense Moses just kind of stuffed it all down. He put off the question of who am I? What was I placed on this earth for? All this stuff, he's stuffing it down, stuffing it down, stuffing it down. And I don't know about you, but if I stuff my emotions down long enough and my questions long enough, what happens? They usually come flowing out at some point. You see, when you fail to deal with your past, when you fail to deal with your issues, they will eventually come back up. And usually not in ways that you would like them to come up. And that's exactly what happens to Moses. It says right here in verse 11, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way, looked that way. He kind of checking to see if anybody's around. And seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. So right here, we begin to see Moses' personality on display a little bit. His humanity, his inner life. Moses, if you've ever done personality types at your work or maybe personally you've done it, Moses' personality type, he's an advocate. He fights for justice. He's a challenger. He's a disruptor. He has this angst in his soul and he wants to see justice in the world. And so when he sees an Egyptian slave master hurting a Hebrew slave, he says that's unjust, that's wrong, and he has an internal drive to take care of it. That's a good thing, right? Moses is going to need that part of his personality to be the deliverer of the Israelite people. But at the same time, all of our personalities, we've got these beautiful parts of who we are, but then there's also what's called the shadow side. There are flaws that are a part of our personality, and this is what we see with Moses. He sees injustice and he flies into a murderous rage. You see, he was angry, but his anger was not fruitful, and it led to a poor, wrong decision. I think of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, which says, "Be angry, but do not sin." Moses was rightfully angry. There's nothing wrong with being angry with seeing injustice. But what was sinful was the manifestation of his anger. His anger manifested itself in murder. And you're like, maybe you don't see yourself in Moses, but here's what I want you to understand is that every personality type out there, every beautiful thing about your personality also has, when unchecked, has a shadow side. So for Moses, he's the advocate type. He hates injustice. That's a good thing. But the shadow side of that is unrestrained anger. For others of you, you're like, I'm not an advocate, I'm a perfectionist. Well, the shadow side of that is that you can be very critical, often with yourself or with others. Or maybe you're here and you're ambitious, and that's something that God has given you, and you have a drive to succeed and a drive for others to succeed. But the shadow side of that is that you're cutthroat, or you'll cut corners to get what you want. Others of you, you're like, I'm just practical. That's my personality. I'm just very practical, and I like to lay things out, and I like things to be nice and orderly and neat, and I like to have a plan. Well, your shadow side is that you're anxious because the plan never goes according to plan, right? You see, we all have these. We are all complex people with these parts of our personalities that are beautiful, but then on the other side of them, there's these shadow sides of it, and this is what we see with Moses. Well, in verse 13, it says, he went out again the next day. And this time he saw two Hebrews struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, he said, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Well, what made you a prince and a judge over us? You mean, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid. Oh, I've been found out. And he says, "Oh no, it's known. Surely this thing is known." And when Pharaoh heard of it, Pharaoh sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now, the very next day, just some context, this is what it seems like to me, reading between the lines a little bit. Moses, he feels pretty proud of himself for killing this slave master. And he kind of sleeps that night, and he's like, I took care of business. And he wakes up the next day, and he says, you know what? I'm going to go out again down into the land, and I'm going to see if there's anything bad happening, and I'm going to take care of it, you know? It's kind of like he goes into superhero mode. He's a vigilante, friendly neighborhood Moses man. You know, he's out there, I'm going to find somebody vulnerable, and I'm going to fix the situation. You know, he feels good about what happened yesterday. So he goes out, he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he's like, hey guys, break it up. And they go, this ain't your business, man. Who do you think you are? You're not the boss over us. And by the way, we know what you did yesterday. And Moses, at that moment, he goes, I've been found out. And what you see in Moses' life is you see he goes out into Egypt as if he was the self-appointed rescuer of the Israelite people. And they said to him, who do you think you are? And now Pharaoh is trying to kill him. So the Israelites don't accept him. Pharaoh is now trying to kill him. He flees to Midian, and now he's back to the question of, who am I? And this is what we've seen so far in Moses' life. Just a recap. Confusing childhood, some trauma, questions of identity, who am I, unresolved anger and emotion, and it all comes to the surface in this one moment. He flies off the handle and he makes everything way worse. Anybody ever done that in your life? You're like, I was trying to fix things and I made it worse. So what happens with Moses? He's no longer welcome in Pharaoh's house, and the Israelites don't welcome him either. And so he's forced to flee into the wilderness, completely alone, into obscurity. This is the first great failure of Moses' life. And failure has a way of making us ask the hard questions. Some of you college students, you haven't hit that point yet. Some of you older folks in this room, you know that there is a time in life where you fail miserably. And your failure will make you question everything. Who am I? What am I doing with my life? What is my purpose here? Is what I've been chasing all along, is that really what matters? Or is there something more? In Moses, it says he goes off into a far country and he sits down at a well, which is an image for reflecting and pondering. And we're not sure the passage of time, but he settles in Midian near a well. He's in solitude. He's living alone. And then one day, verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And they came back and they drew water and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds, though, they came and drove the women away. But Moses stood up and he saved them and he watered their flock. Moses to the rescue again, all right? Here's Moses the deliverer back again. Now, we don't have all the details, but what you see here is that some bad shepherds came in. They were giving these innocent women a hard time, driving them away from the well where they were trying to get water. They were mistreating these women. Moses sees it, steps onto the scene. He drives these shepherds away, and then, so he rescues these women, and then he waters their flock for good measure. So the personality of Moses on display again. He's a challenger, he's an advocate, he's a deliverer. That is in his bones. He loves to protect and deliver people. And we see some growth here. He's matured because he doesn't use violence this time. Okay, way to go, Moses. You're growing up a little bit. And after he rescues these women, he serves them. He waters their flock. That's not something that men ordinarily did in this time and place. And this is kind of funny if you read between the lines. Verse 18, it says, when they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us from the flock. And he said to his daughters, well, where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. It's almost as if this guy's trying to marry his daughters away. And he's like, he's one of the good ones, ladies. Like, he's protecting, he's serving. Go back, get him, bring him back into the house. We want to marry one of you guys away. And so Moses comes in, and it says, and Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. For Moses said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So Moses has a son. He meets a wife, Zipporah. He has a son, and he names the son Gershom, which means I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And you see, here's where the narrative shifts in the book of Exodus. Next week, we're going to see where God specifically calls Moses to become the deliverer of the Hebrew people. But that's what Moses has always wanted to be. He's always wanted to be a deliverer. He's always had justice in his heart. It's what he tried to be when he killed the Egyptian. It's what he tried to be when he was breaking up the fight. But what we see is he was doing that in his own strength. He was doing it for himself, for his own glory. He was doing it to satisfy these questions of identity in his own heart. And as you saw, the Israelites were not impressed, and Egypt didn't need him to be saving the Israelites. The Israelites did not want a self-appointed leader. They wanted a God-ordained one. And Moses had to go into the wilderness to find out who he was and what God was ordaining him to. He was not ready to be Israel's deliverer when he was back in Egypt. He was too selfish. He was too volatile. He had not wrestled with his shadow side. He had not dealt with his past. He had not dealt with his issues. Those things had to be dealt with first before he could fully step into his calling. God had to work in Moses before God could work through Moses. And isn't that true about our lives as well? God has a plan for every single person's life. But if you want to experience the fullness of all that God has for you, what you have to do is lay down your life and let the grace of Jesus sand off the rough edges and replace it with the character of Jesus. God has to work in you before he can then work through you. And some of you, maybe what you need to ask, what issues are holding you back from being the person that God is calling you to be? Are you still on the first mountain? Are you still acting out of self-interest? Are you still acting out of your past trauma? Or have you begun the journey on the second mountain, where you're growing beyond those lesser things into the person that God is calling you to be? And so today what I want to do is I want to give us a couple things, 3 things we can learn from Moses' life that will help us become the person that God is calling us to be. And the first thing is this: you've got to pay attention to what lies beneath the surface. Mr. Rogers, anybody? Yeah? I should have worn a cardigan today to, theme the whole thing. But Mr. Rogers is facing a little bit of experiencing a little bit of a resurgence these days. You've got the Tom Hanks movie, you've got Daniel Tiger. Parents know what I'm talking about, which is the cartoon version of Mr. Rogers. Well, I don't know, if you watch the documentary, Mr. Rogers and Me, one of Mr. Rogers' friends from childhood told a story kind of about how Fred Rogers became Mr. Rogers. See, when Fred Rogers was a little child in elementary school, he was bullied. His friends, the bullies at his school, called him Fat Freddy. And that made Fred Rogers sad. But what he says bothered him the most was not what his friends or what the bullies said to him. He said, what bothered me the most was how the adults in my life tried to comfort me. He said when I would share with my teachers or with my family members that I was being bullied, they would always say to him, Fred, just act like it doesn't bother you, and they'll leave you alone. And he said, that bothered me. He said, because what I needed was not somebody to tell me how to stuff it down. I needed someone to tell me how to deal with the emotions, not to stuff it all down. And Mr. Rogers knew that there was something crucial to naming and feeling our emotions, because he knew that if children across the world didn't understand how to name and process their emotions, that would have disastrous results in adulthood. And that's how Fred Rogers became Mr. Rogers. His television show was about helping kids deal with the pain of life, process their emotions. And I think many of us, not just children, but adults, we don't respect or we aren't aware of the things that are beneath the surface in our own lives. And the truth is, the things that are beneath the surface are often very dangerous if left unchecked. Moses was struggling with some really big issues in his life. He was confused, he was anxious, he was internalizing anger and frustration, and he clearly had not dealt with it well, because in a moment it all comes to the surface and he kills somebody. One author says, in that one moment, Moses saw the destructive power of his raw and unrefined self. And what did he do? He fled. He didn't walk, he didn't jog, he ran away from his life as fast as he could. He fled to Midian, he sat down at a well. And this imagery is of him pondering and reflecting on what he had done and how he had got to that point. And here's the thing, when you have faced trauma or suffering or hardship in your life, there is a time where you must reflect on it and how that has shaped you. Because as Henry Nouwen says, he says, suffering that is not transformed will be transmitted. Our suffering in our lives, if we don't deal with it today, we will transmit it to others tomorrow. When we have issues in our heart, whether it's unresolved anger or fear or worry or sadness or loneliness or shame or guilt, those things, if we don't deal with them, they will come to the surface in devastating ways. And this is precisely what Jesus himself said on the Sermon on the Mount. He said, you feel like you're not guilty of murder. He said, but really what murder is it's anger in the heart that hasn't been checked. He says, adultery. Adultery is lust that's in the heart that has been left unchecked. Jesus knew that the issues that are unresolved in our hearts will eventually come to the surface and manifest itself in destructive ways. And so Jesus calls us to repent of what is in our heart before it gets to our hands. Pay attention to what lies beneath. Second thing we learn from Moses' life is that you've got to name your struggles. You've got to name your hurts and your habits and your hang-ups and your sins and your shames. I love how this story ends. It ends with Moses having a child and naming him Gershom. Now, in American culture, names don't usually mean much, you know? And for most people these days, it's like, what name sounds good and goes well with my last name and doesn't have initials that would get my kid made fun of, right? It's like names don't mean much in American culture, but in biblical culture, names meant everything. And when Moses names his son Gershom, which means I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, it's as if Moses is coming to grips with his past. He's naming the struggle of his life. He's admitting, I've never felt at home. Not among the Egyptians, not among the Hebrews. He's naming that he's always wrestled with his identity. Who am I? I feel like a sojourner in a foreign land. This is Moses admitting to himself the struggle of his life. This is self-awareness. Ruth Haley Barton, she says, this was a profound admission by Moses. It took a very long time, but finally, Moses was able to acknowledge what was underneath the behavior that had gotten him where he was. And he was finally able to admit that all his life he had struggled with his identity, and now he was mad about it. See, he's beginning to come to grips with his past. He's beginning to see where all this anger comes from. And he knows, see, with Moses, you have this good desire in his heart to advocate for the oppressed. That's good anger. But he saw that his unresolved anger was causing his desire for justice to manifest itself in these ugly ways. And it was keeping him from living out the calling that God had placed on his life. And the story of Moses shows us that you're not the only person who's had a confusing childhood. And you're not the only person who's had a traumatic past. But the story of Moses also shows us that our past does not have to dictate our future. It does not have to have the final word. And Moses, what he did was he embraced his struggle, he named the source of his angst, and he no longer allowed it to dictate the course of his life. And this was a crucial moment in his life. Because before he could ever be able to lead others into freedom from slavery, he needed to experience the freedom himself. In the two previous churches that I've served, both churches have hosted a Celebrate Recovery ministry. I don't know if you've heard about Celebrate Recovery, but it's similar to like Alcoholics Anonymous, but with biblical principles kind of tied into it. It's a 12-step program. And at Celebrate Recovery, when someone introduces themselves, they say, my name is blank. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and I struggle with blank. Pride, entitlement, pornography, greed, gluttony, gambling, alcoholism, eating disorder, mental health, whatever. And for some of you, if I were to stand up right now and just pass the microphone around and say, I want every one of you to introduce yourself. Say, my name is blank, and I am a follower of Jesus, and I struggle with blank. If I handed you the microphone, some of you are terrified. And you're like, I couldn't do it. Some of you, your pride would never allow you to name out loud your real struggle. But if you ask anyone who has committed themselves, and I'll tell you, that's holding you back. Your unwillingness to name, your inability, the pride that keeps you from naming your struggle, it holds you back, because anyone who has committed themselves to the process of recovery will tell you there is freedom in being honest about and naming your struggles. Because one of the great promises of the Bible is that when you bring your sin, shame, and past into the light, you can overcome it because it has no power over you any longer. Ephesians 5 says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Some of you are holding on so tightly to your inner struggle when the scriptures say that if you expose it in the light, share it with others, name your struggle, that is where healing begins. So name your struggle. And then finally, and I'll be real quick with this, embrace the wilderness. Embrace the wilderness. Next week, we're going to pick up on this narrative, but it'll be after Moses spends another 40 years in the wilderness. Moses spends 40 years in obscurity, tending sheep and raising a family. Once a wealthy prince in Egypt, now a poor shepherd in the wilderness. And we all know Moses as the big deliverer who lifts his staff and parts the Red Sea and all this sort of stuff, but we forget that there were 40 years of his life where he lived in obscurity. And many of us, we hate obscurity and we hate the wilderness and we want everything to happen. We want God to accomplish what he's going to accomplish in our lives right now. But in the Bible, you see this theme come up over and over and over again, and that is that God will lead people into wilderness seasons, most often long wilderness seasons, so that in the wilderness, he can work on them, he can transform them, he can shape them so that they can emerge ready to be the person that God has called them to be. Moses, it was in the wilderness he learned how to lead sheep, and that prepared him to lead God's people. It was in the wilderness where David learned how to be a king. It was in the wilderness where Jacob saw the stairway to heaven. It was in the wilderness where Elijah heard the still small voice of God. It was in the wilderness where John the Baptist preached the message of repentance. It was in the wilderness where the Apostle Paul searched the scriptures and prepared for a life of ministry. And it's in the wilderness outside of the city where Jesus was crucified, which paved the way for his resurrection, which will lead us all into new life. And it's in the wilderness. It's in the dry seasons, it's in the treacherous seasons, it's in the seasons where you think no good could come of this, and it's in the seasons where you feel like there's no way out. Those are the seasons where God will most form you into the person he's called you to be, if you will allow him to do his work in your heart. Because most of us in the wilderness seasons, we just fight God. We get mad at him for sending us into the wilderness, but it's in the wilderness where if you surrender yourself to what he wants to do in your life, he will accomplish his good purposes in your life. And so real quick as I close, some of you hear that, you're like, pay attention to what lies beneath, name your struggle. That just sounds like something my therapist would say. I hope that's good. I hope I've given you good advice. And you're like, what's Christian about that? What's Christian about that? Well, here's what's Christian about it. To name your struggle and to pay attention to what lies beneath, that is the most painful thing you can ever do. Because it's you admitting what's inside. And often if we admit what's inside, then we have to deal with what's there. And that makes us afraid. But I find comfort in knowing that in the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus knew what was in every heart. Jesus knew what was in the heart of Judas. Jesus knew what was in the heart of the prostitutes. Jesus knew what was in the heart of the tax collectors. Jesus knew what was in the heart of the Pharisees. Jesus knew what was in the heart of Nicodemus. He knew what was in everybody's heart, but yet he reached out in love. He named the struggle, and yet he did not abandon them in their fear and in their shame, but rather he lifted them up out of it. And I don't know about you, I go to therapy, but knowing that God will never leave me or forsake me is what gives me the confidence to be able to go to the hard places in my inner life and trust that God has a good purpose for my life, and that because he is with me and he will not forsake me, I can name the struggles and I can go to the hard things in the inner life because I believe that he wants to work on those things and he wants to lead me into the life that he's called me to live. Moses had to go into the wilderness to become the deliverer that the people of Israel needed. And many of us, we need to go into the wilderness of our own lives. We may have to go through suffering or struggle to know what we're made of. And when we learn what we're made of, that's where we develop patience and empathy and wisdom and perseverance. And those are the things that God uses to make you a blessing to the world around you. So would you trust God with your life, with your inner life? Would you trust God with what he's doing? Would you submit yourself and surrender yourself to the work that God is doing in your heart and in your life? Don't fear it. Don't be afraid of it. But trust that God's good purposes he wants to bring forth in your life by making you more like his son, Jesus. Let me pray for you, church. God, I thank you for God, I thank you that this book of Exodus is this story of redemption. But God, before you could redeem the people of Israel, you had to redeem Moses. And God, I know that for many of us, whether it's a father or a mother or a brother or sister or husband or wife, we want you to use us to bless other people in this world. But God, before you can use us to be a blessing to others, you must first transform us. And so God, I'm asking you to transform me. Would you knock off the rough edges of my life? God, I'm asking that you would knock off the rough edges of anyone here's lives so that we can be the people that you've called us to be and step into the calling you've placed before us. And we pray all these things in your name. Amen. Church, would you stand? We're going to sing a song of response. The Spirit may be leading you. You may need prayer. If you would like somebody to pray for you, pray with you, I'm down here. Pastor Dan's down here. We would love to pray with you, pray for you, pray over you. If you're here and you just need to release a struggle, you need to confess, I'm in the wilderness, and God, I'm just going to trust you to do your work in the wilderness. You can come and just lay down at this altar. If you're here and you want to know more about what it looks like to follow Jesus or to become a part of this church, I'm here, Dan's here. We would love to answer any questions you have. But however the Spirit of God is leading you right now, would you listen to that, and would you take the next step as we sing?